Hello, this is Darren Pulsipher, Chief Solution Architect of Public Sector at Intel, and welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. On today's episode, Modern Data Governance with Matt Carroll, CEO of Immuta. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Intel, we've been doing some work with Immuta for some time. When I heard about your story and what it does, I said, we've got to get Immuta, we've got to get the CEO on the phone, talk to him. Let's get him on the show. So we finally got you. I know you've been swamped. That's what startups are all about, is being swamped. So welcome to the show, Matt. And tell me a little bit about why you're doing what you're doing.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we obviously love our relationship with Intel. I would say, the past 5-6 years that we've been doing this, we've seen the whole compute infrastructure layer just change right in front of us, right? And that's really the nexus of our story. That's why we're here is as all of these corporations or organizations migrate to the cloud, what we've come to realize quite quickly is the way we think about data and the way we think about using data is completely changing. The performance we need, the scale we need, the amount of users that want to access the data, the amount of users who want to combine data has just increased exponentially. And so like anything else in all these environments, so have the rules of using data. And to manage that at scale is not trivial. And at the core of Immuta, that's what we're doing, right? Is how do you not just scale your data? It's not about big data anymore. It's about how do I scale my data operations, which is a fleet of people using data. And we're just trying to help be a part of that.
So it's really interesting how you brought up, we're changing the way that we're interacting with data. There's lots more roles than there were before, because my first gut when I heard about data governance and things like that was, what we already have permissions, we already have access control, authorization. Come on, AAA security has been around forever, and you're going to just add another layer on top. What's the deal here? It just sounded like a solution chasing a problem when I first heard about it, but then I got schooled by your team. So
yeah. Well, there's a lot more lawyers now. So
there you go.
But in reality, if you look at it, like what's happening is this. I think in Silicon Valley, they would say, we're democratizing access to data. I don't think that's it, right? That's if I gave you a boatload of data, you wouldn't really know what to do with it, right? Previous exercises, and if you look at, we went from warehousing, which I think everyone was totally fine with. Then we threw Hadoop at people and they were like, that's the right thing to do. And it was pretty complex and not very economically sustainable. And now we're back to warehousing again. And I think what's happened over time, though, is we've rethought the paradigm of warehousing. Before it was, hey, we have these data models and we have our data teams that are in silos and they build data products that we deliver to a business unit, right? And so you kind of have each business unit would have their appropriate data teams that would go deliver some sort of quality service to them. Now, where that's changing now, though, is all of a sudden we want anyone to be able to combine data across the enterprise, right? So all these new users, from really data savvy people to business analysts to data scientists to data engineers, I think everyone just added data into their title now, and they somehow use it. So it's changed the number of users. But the most important thing, it's not about search or applications. It's about transform and data pipelines. And that is the difference, is that requires a different quality of service. It requires a different uptime. It requires a level of sophistication of policy that never existed before.
So do you think that, because you joked about the lawyers a little bit, but that's even adding more complexity, right? Privacy laws and classification of data, that's been thrown into the mix as well. So
yep,
that's just making the whole data governance more complex. Is that really your sweet spot where, hey, we make that complexity a little more manageable? Or
It's all about scale, right? So like our piece of it is at the core, if you think about what we're trying to do is you're trying to make it so any user could potentially combine any data set, internal, external to your company or organization, combine it and get some insight, right? Where we fit in, and like we're a big believer in this is that just like we had to separate compute from storage and big data to scale for petabyte, scale queries, we need to separate policy from platform to be able to scale policy for all these new users and all these different combinations of data. And so what we learned, one, from so many lawyers around us when we all worked in the US government, and the intelligence community loves their lawyers, was, gosh, there's to make queries perform, because the one thing we learned is this: security, privacy, governance, it's great, but if you can't perform, no one's happy, right? It's got to work fast. So to perform and support, gosh, I don't know how many use cases from different, what I would say, levels of technologists, from, Excel jockeys to, advanced machine learning algorithms, you need to be able to separate out that policy from the core platform, because there's going to be a lot of different platforms. As we go away from, like I talked about, these kind of siloed data engineering workflows to any user being able to hit a lake, a warehouse, or these data exchanges, it completely changed the paradigm and complexity and scale of these data environments.
so you've separated the access policy from the actual technology itself, right? I mean,
That's
from
correct.
whatever technology they're using, like you said, Excel spreadsheets or Hadoop clusters or whatever it is. So normally when we do abstraction, there's always a performance hit,
Yeah,
almost always, right?
correct.
So are you seeing that performance hit too? I mean, I'm guessing when you guys first did this, it was probably dog slow, would be my guess.
Yeah, we a lot of lessons learned there, right? So the first major lesson that we learned was you can't proxy it, right? So like as you try, like if you look at like Databricks or Snowflake or Redshift or Starburst, right? They all distribute these queries in their way, right? But like at the end of the day, what we realize is if you try to proxy it, you try to move petabytes of data through a straw, like, hey, call me, tell me what
You
to do.
now become the bottleneck.
Yeah, we become the
Yeah.
bottleneck, and then everyone blames you. I mean, this is classic middleware problem, right? Is the challenge you face in middleware is if there is an issue, they will blame you, right?
Yeah,
And so
that's true.
it's very easy because the tools connect to you and then you connect to the data. You are always a bottleneck, no matter what. And the second problem with that design paradigm is because if you look at like classic data virtualization, it worked in its time. And people say, okay, we federate out queries, we bring it into a caching layer, and then we'll work through whatever we need to do, whether it's master data management, we need to do policy, et cetera. The problem is that's only good if you have like a clear set of data. But when you're talking about petabytes of data, and anyone that's worked with data scientists, you tell me if there's a pattern in their queries, because generally I just see select star from all. So it's just give me everything and then
That's
I'll figure
true.
it out,
That's
right?
very true. I'll figure it. You just give me all the data, right?
Yeah. And then it's like, that didn't work. There's like, countries like China that are just not okay with giving away everything. So when you get into that paradigm, the problem is it just breaks down very quickly because of the sheer size of the data, as well as just all the rules and policies around it, right? So the challenge is, the number one lesson we learned is proxy won't work, nor will virtualization. You have to natively embed into that cloud compute infrastructure to make it work, right?
Oh,
So that's
interesting.
natively in Databricks, natively in Snowflake, natively in Synapse, et cetera, et cetera.
So you kind of took a different approach to this. Instead of putting an abstraction layer on top of these different tools in the operational mode, you put the abstraction layer kind of on the policy side. So now I write a general policy that can apply across all these different tool sets.
Correct. Because the policy,
interesting.
And the policy is only as good as the ability to audit it. think of it as like evidence, right? So it's like chain of evidence. I'm going to go into court someday. I have to prove I wrote this policy, it worked appropriately, this person either complied or did not comply with it, and I can prove that across all of my compute infrastructure. That's the key. So the thing is with modern data governance is, one, it's scaling policy, but then two, it's unifying audits. Because of the level of complexity of how many people are doing so many things with data, you need to dramatically simplify the audit of that policy. Otherwise, it's just impossible to know whether or not you complied.
That's really interesting. I don't think people really catch that a lot of times, because when I think of data governance, I am thinking of data security and protection more than I'm thinking auditability and compliance. Right. And that maybe that's because of the world that I've lived in the past, but the auditability and compliance actually feed into security as well. So
absolutely. No one wants to go in front of a congressional hearing and not have pretty easily usable audit logs, right? Of what
yeah, that is true. That is very true. So you mentioned scalability. So and you mentioned that we have to span across multiple tools. So is this kind of a unifying, this data governance concept? I can unify multiple data warehouses or data lakes with one global or a set of global policies, data governance policies with this concept. Is
that's the key, right?
Gotcha.
When I think about policy, right? I think of three types of policies. There's operational policies on my data. Who can access it? When can they access it? Why can they access? Because that's our operational rules in this business, right?
Right.
Marketing doesn't need to have access to HR data. Right? There's no regulation per se, usually that oversees that, or contractual obligations. Just operationally, we have good policy on that, right?
Right.
Then there's contractual. Hey, I'm working with these other vendors, right? I'm an American Express card on my loyalty cards business. Let's just say, Neiman Marcus doesn't need to see Nordstrom data, right? And vice versa, right? There's probably good contractual reasons for that. And then there's regulatory, right? There's actual laws out there that says this is the standards you have to have, right? So like if I need to comply with HIPAA. So you have three types of like what I would consider strong policies for modern organizations. The question is if I have to, let's go to a case here where, let's talk about, gosh, I don't know. Cummins is a good example. Old school company, right? Modernizing the cloud. If they have to, for every market, one of their engines exists, they have to write a custom rule of, well, as long as you're in this country, but I have to write a rule for every country you're not in, you can't see it, right? Like that doesn't scale when you're talking about tens of thousands of data sources where the schema is constantly changing, petabytes upon petabytes of telemetry from these engines. It just doesn't make sense, right? You want to write, all right, you can only see this data for the country that you reside in once, and then it applies everywhere across
everywhere.
Global
Gotcha.
data infrastructure, right? But that's not the way it's done. So you're writing like on average 700 policies for a data object where it should only be one rule.
No, I think I understand. You're kind of in a really tough spot when you think about it. I have number of data sources exploding. I also have number of policies, regulations exploding as well. And when you throw all those together, like you were mentioning, just keeping up with that on each data source would be unwieldy. You'd be out of compliance all the time.
You can't, because the other problem is this. I mean, how many data engineers have you met?
Real ones?
Yeah, real data engineers.
None.
None. Okay, well,
because you know what happens? It happened way back when they first started doing DevOps.
Yeah.
It was the developer that knew Linux system commands, and he ended up being it. Same thing's happening with the data engineers. It's a data scientist that also knew some sysadmin stuff, and he got he got a hat, right?
And- Yep. And how old are, like the way I would say is like, think about how old these folks are, right? The average age. They're in their 20s, young, like early 30s, right? This is a new domain, it's a new job.
New, yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's all new. They don't have 20, 30 years of working in financial services and how these rules work, or they're old curmudgeon in the Intel community and they know how D&I is going to push policy down and interpret it into code. They're new. And so the problem is they don't know how to interpret. I call it woe is the data engineer. They have no clue how to interpret the law and put it into logical code that can scale.
Well,
Right?
are there many people that know how to do that?
I don't, I mean, like, listen, if you can find me any lawyers that can actively write code, I'll hire them on the spot. So I don't want anyone on this podcast listening to think you're gonna beat me to that. But I think, no, it's not only is it not possible, it's not responsible, right? Because the
Right.
second thing that's happening, there's this big trend right now of globalization. Never before in the world has it been easier to globalize a company than today.
I would
Right.
agree. Yes, I totally agree.
I mean, it is now, it's on average, most startups are looking to sell globally.
Yeah.
Right. And so the way I see policy happening is it's not a killer app. It's not like an app where I can make these policies and all of a sudden it just works. This is part of the new global infrastructure. Our customers expect us to be able to run as infrastructure globally across any cloud. They should be able to operate on any cloud, move their data in any cloud, and be in full compliance instantaneously.
I really love the concept. And I like what you guys did by not being the proxy. Because it takes you out of the performance loop, which I think is great. But here's a question I have then.
Mhm.
I'm guessing there are still a lot of policies that I'm going to have to write as a consumer of your product,
Yeah.
right? Or do you guys have some canned compliance packages like a HIPAA compliance package
Mhm.
where, hey, patient ID data blacked out,
Yeah.
right? I mean, because I have dealt with some other companies that did like compliance, not with data. They did it with machine infrastructure.
Mhm.
And I could go buy a HIPAA compliance package for my infrastructure side, or I could go buy a PCI compliant for my infrastructure. Is that something that you see as viable in this space, or for data, or is data just too complex that I can't do that?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's very valid. There's two things that are always impediments to success, right? To our time to value. The first is, how do I just get all my data in there and understand it? Because there's just so much of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we've built things like data classifiers, and so we're tagging data so you can discover things about it, but it's mostly around applying rules to the data through tags versus using the raw data, because each domain has their own jargon about how they talk about their data and classify it, right? So we've generically started classifying and tagging it, so that way you could apply templates. And so, we do have general concept templates like HIPAA and what used to be CCPA and GDPR, et cetera. But we have a long way to go as well. Those are not foolproof. You need to understand how you're applying what we call a global policy. Our vision, or at least my vision, as long as I'm CEO, I get to have some say, is, how do we get to a state where domains can potentially share their policies, right? Healthcare, if I'm Pfizer and I want to work with Moderna, which there's probably a dang good reason to do that, hey, we can share our policies on how we handle real world data controls with academia, right? And we can agree on how we're going to do that. So we have consistent policy across that. That's where our company is going, is this concept of like a policy cloud where people can start sharing and crowdsourcing their policy based on their domain, because it's the right thing to do.
Oh, I love that concept. I think it's brilliant, because it's very complex.
Very. And it's domain specific, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if
very
you can
domain specific.
you can, and I've participated in these things in the government, in the US government, right? And I can't tell you how many meetings, I've sat in where we try to create a single ontology of our data, right?
And you
And
can't, can you?
and it's not possible, right? So if you can remove that and you say, hey, like we can scan the sensitive stuff in there, like don't worry about it. Machine learning in the cloud has gotten so good. Like Microsoft has a PI service, Google does as well. There's ways where we can scan our data, tag it for direct and indirect identifiers to privacy. So that doesn't matter. What matters is, hey, generally when we see PI or PHI or whatever, if I'm Pfizer or Moderna, hey, this is generally the policy we would apply to it, and we come to an agreement. Then any other pharmaceutical or, let's just say healthcare provider, et cetera, wants to leverage that, they can pull it down. That's where our vision is. That's where we're going. Because we want to make that policy inheritance super easy, but also like, this is the other thing I tell people is there's nothing like, you're not going to have a competitive advantage by using Immuta. If I'm two banks using Immuta, you don't get a competitive advantage using us, right? Like the thing about a data governance is, and this is, you just can be honest with yourself, is this like consistency is better, right? If we all have the same policy on this, the regulators are going to say, well, no one was negligent,
Right. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and do something wonderful.